Welcome to another episode of Artist Spotlight, the podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Stringer. As always, we're brought to you in partnership with the Maryland Photography Alliance, where you can check out all sorts of good insight for photographers, whether it's photo walks or contests, different events and information. It really is a wealth of information for you to be able to check out, and you can do that by going to mdphotoalliance.org. Typically, if you check out the site and you come back a week or 10 days later, there's additional information that can update you and really help you make the most of the hobby or the career that you have. And I definitely want to encourage you to take a good look at that. Well, this episode, I'm joined by a gentleman that I became aware of probably a year or so ago, which makes me about as late to the party as you can be late to anything, because Phil Caruso's career began 40 years earlier than what I even became aware. So shame on me, but I do need to thank our mutual friend, Rob Terrell, for letting me know that. And with that, welcome Phil Caruso to the podcast.
Mitch, we've only spoken once prior, but it feels like the 40 years have been filled with your energy and your knowledge. You have a great series going. You have one of the most extensive podcast lists that I've come across. And as I said, over at least 50 guests, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for being here. You know, we've had guests from a number of genres, everything from sports to wildlife to celebrity portraiture and boudoir, and the list kind of goes on. And, you know, maybe in your next 40 years, you can tackle boudoir or something like that. But for the last 40, you have really been kind of a go-to guy in a field that we have not talked about on this podcast, and that is motion picture and television still photography, something that I've been fascinated by, going back to understanding not only movie posters, but lobby cards, talk about something from the past. So, you know, when somebody says, you know, Phil, nice to meet you, what do you do? What's that 30-second elevator speech like to explain what you do? Because it's not something that's common.
The pitch was, I secure imagery, still photography imagery, for basically the marketing department, for studios, television channels, streamers now, for publicity and advertising. You're trying to recreate the visual imagery from a script. That's the shortest answer to get to it. And then I have to work in the confines of a director and a cameraman and 150 crew people to get the imagery. It's funny because when you said you've had sports, wildlife, and boudoir photographers, well, I do all of that too, but they call it movies. So that's why it's all the same genres, because then I started thinking about it. Oh, yeah, well, I've done a sports movie and I've done some of this, and the boudoir, you know, whether you're in the room when it happens or not. So it is,
Yeah.
but ultimately you're creating that one image, which is the poster or the magazine covers to publicize a movie.
Well, and, you know, looking at some of the work you've done and the folks you've worked with, the expression is overused, but it applies. It's a who's who, you know, having worked with Ron Howard and Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg and just, you know, Bob De Niro. And, you know, it's incredible. Movies like Forrest Gump, you know, the catalog of work that you've done is very it's very broad, and it is a who's who and a what's what of Hollywood and television. So, you know, one question I have is, you know, certainly each movie has its various scenes and has its various themes. Would you say that if you're shooting a movie, regardless of the movie, 70 or 80% of your deliverables for your work are the same, and then a much smaller percentage differ based on the director, based on the actual movie, the locations of the movie? I'm just trying to get a sense of how different each job is in the movie.
Boy, thank you. Your line of questions are great so far.
It's early.
No, and some research thereof. No, because you also are delving deep into something. The idea the background is I was raised within the film community of motion picture and television, motion picture work, from the hardcore, the analog side of it, to shoot film, to shoot. But I knew I wanted to be a cameraman, a DP, a director of photography in film. So to get to this answer is that you have to read the project, you have to have passion for it, you've got to know it, you have to know the script in and out, you got to know what the studio wants, and you have to be that conduit to not be in a director's way and look at his imagery. What I've learned along the way is that you're there under the grace of the director. You may have been placed there by the studio, but you know it's his set. You may be there because of the Navy put you there, but he's the captain of the ship. So it's one of those kind of delicate moments to get through. Luckily, and I've been lucky that the people you mentioned, I credit Ron Howard as being like a pivotal moment, because prior you worked with non-union or very small productions union-wise in the very beginning of my career, in the 44 years that I was making entry into the union. But when I got to Ron, that was like the real moment. That was filmmaking, because he had been on a set from as young as I was, in terms of him being a kid raised around a set. And we got along famously. And you learn that his vision may not be the same as what the studio wants. And you have to walk that line to do that. And I learned what control the directors have. And you start working your way through those little nooks and crannies of politics. By the time I got to the second movie with Ron, which was Backdraft, the first movie was Parenthood, which the studio, can I jump into some of these?
Absolutely. Yeah, of course.
So the first movie with Ron was Parenthood, and it was an ensemble cast in the studio. Before they had put me on the project to do what's called unit photography. I'm there every day. 50-day schedule, 100-day schedule. I'm there every day. And you're photographing scenes that are important scenes. You may be needed to do set dressing pictures, et cetera. So then they come around and they say, well, we're going to do an ad shoot, an advertising shoot, the poster shoot. And someone else may have been under contract, like someone you may have had the courtesy through a previous podcast with, that he's contracted to come in and do this type of imagery. They come in specifically, as I have been contracted to do posters for movies that I didn't shoot. I didn't shoot the whole movies on stuff, but the studios hired me to come in and do the posters for it. So on the second movie with Ron, it was another one, but even a bigger ensemble cast. It was Backdraft. And the studio said, we're going to send someone and this and that. And Ron, I could see it. And he started telling me, he's going, this is not theoretic, this wasn't the imagery, but he wants to play, he has to go along because Universal's writing the check. So he's like understanding it, but he says, and I'll remember, he goes, we, meaning the filmmakers, want to create our own advertising. So how can we do this? And I remember working like with him and his producer, and we would come up with ideas, and I would shoot, and then you don't tell the studio, and it was like always this back and forth kind of thing. And if you look at the poster for Backdraft, it's the thing was, you also have to know the contracts. And that's what I learned also, luckily, with a publicist that I've been matched up with on Parenthood, that he said, first thing he said was, we're going to read the contracts for the actors. And I had never had that. I'd never been involved in a movie with like people with contracts that had stipulations about edits, of saying they had kill rights and all of this. Like they could approve 50%. You could shoot 10 pictures. They had to approve 5 of them. Or, but it's all a legal interpretation. Do they kill 5 or do they approve 5? So I used to get into that with it. So the point was, on Backdraft, every one of these actors, inclusive of De Niro, which was the first movie that I worked with Robert De Niro, and they had to be on the poster. And it was one of those things that it would be a dozen people, Rebecca De Mornay, Scott Glenn, it would be this whole thing. And Ron kept saying, he goes, I want to just tell this as a one kind of thing. So we're shooting a scene. Kurt Russell walks out of a burning doorway, and it's a silhouette. He emerges as a silhouette, and then he walks into the light and has a conversation with De Niro. But when he's in there in his silhouette, I'm shooting and I can see the thing around him. And it's like one of my expressions was it was a euphoric moment. And I went, oh my God, that's it. Because there's fire around him. We know it's Kurt Russell because we're shooting him every day. The audience doesn't know. They just know it's a fireman. And I said,
Mhm.
that's what Ron made the connection. And he goes, that's what I'm trying to portray. And so then you go into the legal side, talking with the publicist, same publicist from the first movie, Andy Lipschultz, and said, listen, it says if the likeness of Kurt Russell is on the poster, then legally you have to put everyone else. And I said, but if it's an unknown likeness, do we still have to fulfill the rest of this? And it was like the legal people were like, we never thought of it that way. So I said, well, if you can't see him, but we know it's him, then we don't legally have to put everyone out. And that's the way we got the poster done. And you go, okay. So then from that point, Ron goes, oh, you're in now. So then the second movie or the third movie with him was Far and Away. It was with Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman. And, you're going to put those two people on the poster.
Sure.
So, that's where it stopped. But Ron was it was, so what they do is the studio takes the imagery and they put what they call comps together, ideas of treatments. They said, we think it looks like this, we think it looks like that. And I'll never forget, we were in, we had 3 months in Ireland and a couple of months, 2 or 3 months in Montana on Far and Away. And then we went to Ireland. And it may have been by the time we got all the way to Ireland, the studio sent these treatment boards, like 2430s, and they laid them out on the floor and all of this. And I remember someone came to get me and said, Ron wants to see you. And he came in the room, and there were like a dozen of them laid out on the floor. And I was like, wow. And Ron goes, look, this is all your work. And I went, wow. And he goes, they want him to, vote on which poster he was leaning towards. And he asked me, he goes, well, which one do you like? And I went, what, director never asked me. And I was like, wow. So that's why I credit Ron for a major, major part of this process and learning the legal side and the whole thing, the way the studio system works. And from that point, catapulted. De Niro asked me to move to New York. Subsequently, a year or so, whatever the timeline was, I did Cape Fear, and between that, met Martin Scorsese, as says he, and then we went to Florida to shoot that movie, Cape Fear, and subsequently I moved to New York from LA, and I did over 20 something movies with De Niro and a half a dozen things with Scorsese, and that's it. And thanks, everybody. That's it. There you go.
Right. Thank you and good night. Well, more important than working with Scorsese and De Niro and New York, you met another person when you moved back to New York that has changed your life from that point to present day. You're bearing the lead, Phil.
That's part of the process. I used to go, what I would say is someone, I was living happily in LA. And then someone put a gun to my head and moved me to New York. And through De Niro's request to live in New York and Scorsese, that I walked in and I met my wife. And so we've been married 32 years. I got, oh shit.
better get that right.
2 more weeks. I think it's in 2 weeks is the anniversary. Oy. And then 2 glorious children. And there you go. So I said, otherwise, I would have stayed in LA. That would have been it.
I just got you out of jail by bringing up that. So here is I'll call it a Stanley Kubrick influence question. He obviously is a legendary director, and not only that, but a real photography aficionado. And so my question is, you working with all the gentlemen that you just mentioned, and I know dozens and dozens more that we haven't even talked about yet. Do you think that with those directors having an eye for composition, for lighting, for all the things that they have to have, do you feel like all of them, I'm sure is a stretch, but all of them, some of them, what percentage of them, and are there any that stuck out who really kind of had a outward appreciation for photography because it was kind of part and parcel of just composing what they would do when they would shoot a movie or a television program?
Singly, Marty
Okay.
Scorsese. That, I mean, in the short answer of it, and he and I, from day one, got along famously, still get along in terms of there was a 5-part series that Rebecca Miller just directed, came out called Mr. Scorsese. If you see that, you'll see a lot of my photographs from Casino, Cape Fear, Age of Innocence. We worked a month together, and it was like when people contact Marty for a retrospect book or a photo request, he says call Phil because he's got the archives of the stuff. But Marty from day one just appreciated it, and little things like, again, on Cape Fear, I show up and I'm scared to death, and I'm like on his set, and I'm shooting, and within the first week I went over and I'm walking around looking for an angle for something, and he comes over and stands by me, and I go, what, something wrong, what's going on? He goes, no, he goes, he had always known, he says, always go stand by the still photographer because he's always looking for another angle, and he goes, I want to see what you're seeing. And I went, okay. And that's the good part. Now the other part, which no names are being said, I've worked with directors that could care less. And it's just like you go, okay, well, I know my role in this. So I'm like a treated crew member. I do what I do and keep everybody else happy and stay out of his way, but he could care less. And then sometimes you work with people, they don't even care what they're shooting on film on the project. And you go, oh my God, but some of these things you get into, seriously, he really was the one. And on Cape Fear, there was a moment after a month into it or something, I took a specific shot of Bob De Niro with his arms
Mm-hmm.
outstretched when he was being body searched in this jail. And I got on the ground on a 24 mil lens to make it sound technical. And they were going to film it through the glass, and they were shooting close ups of his tattoos and stuff on him. And I got on the ground and shot this low angle. And in those days, I would go through the contact sheets. Sometimes, like De Niro subsequently later allowed me to do his kills and his edit as Marty. But weekly, I would sit down with Marty with like 5x7s or 8x10s. I would have the lab print and say, for approval purposes, I like this, I like that. And he would go through and go, yes, yes. And also, what I learned from him was that he owned everything. Marty did. And you used the word deliverables, which in the business side, you have to learn that. He contractually only had to turn in a couple of hundred black and white and a couple of hundred color deliverables to the studio. And that's when his publicist told me, oh, no, Marty owns everything. And I went, oh, so that's how this works. So it doesn't go to the studio first, it goes right to his hands. Point is, I shot the picture of Bob. I showed him the picture. Marty was in his chair and he jumped up with the photograph. That's it. That's it. He goes, that's the poster. That's going to be the poster. Well, he sends it through the system. About a couple weeks later, whatever, he goes, the studio sent some guy to talk to Marty on location about marketing stuff going on. And Marty goes, oh yeah, and by the way, the studio guy goes, oh yeah, and by the way, that picture of Bob, that's not going to be the poster. That's they were scared to death. They were scared to death of having that kind of imagery. And Marty was like really just offended and peed out. He always said that should have been the poster. And they used, like, again, contractually, you had to have the other actors in the picture.
Yeah.
So they took this family photo of the three actors, and they had Bob in the water, which was still my picture with his eyes or something. And you go, eh, you know. So that was the fight of it. But Marty overall, and even on Bringing Out the Dead, which was another movie he directed with Nick Cage, and plus I had to have a meet. You would have a meeting with him and with Marty and the production designer and the assistant director, maybe weeks or a month ahead of time, and they would lay out photographs like your photographs behind you, Mitch, on the wall. Those are set dressing photographs in the film world.
Hmm.
Okay. So that imagery has to be created by me
Oh, wow.
for the movie. So Marty would have a meeting, and the script, which I'd already read at that point, would be broken down, and it would be a list of still photographs. And if it was a picture on the wall of Mitch and his wife's wedding, well, guess what? We have to stage a wedding just to have a still photo, and that's the way it was. There was a picture of Nick Cage doing something, and all of this stuff is taken into account, and it has to be scheduled. And the ideal situation on some movies is that it's built into the schedule before we start filming, which is a godsend because then you have a day, 3 days, a week, whatever's necessary to get the makeup, hair, wardrobe, to build a call sheet that has all of the stuff that's needed to do those things. The flip of it is in the production schedule over the last decades of time, it's all about the money. So then they'll say, we don't want to take the time before we start shooting to do a still shoot, as it's called. We want to do it while we're filming, like on the day. That's this famous line. And so you may be filming a scene about such and such, and the actor that was in that wedding photograph on the wall, they're not working that day. But then the assistant director will say, well, we're going to bring them in and we're going to go find a room somewhere and we're going to set this up and we're going to do this. And then we're going to grab the still guy. So when he's finished over, not even finished, but when you got a break or something from over doing the regular scene coverage, we're going to extract you and run you over here and you're going to shoot. And then all of a sudden you got like 90 seconds. Come on, hurry up, be creative. And you go do it. And then you got to go run back and do something else. So Marty's very aware of it, and it was laid out and it was scheduled. The best of all was a movie called Age of Innocence that Marty directed. And I had the idea based on previous work with Ron Howard that we did a coffee table book on Far and Away.
Oh,
We,
nice.
meaning Universal, approved it, and Tom Cruise approved the photos, and there was a hardcover book. So I thought, okay, that's my first book. So I'm thinking, oh, I'm jazzed now. So the next movie along the way was in the lineup was Age of Innocence, and I said to Marty, we need to do a book. That would be great. Well, he blew up because he said that's perfect because he had never done a book of his creation. We had a meeting before the movie was ever filmed, and he wrote the template for the book to be laid out, the outline. Chapter one is this, chapter two is that. And I went, oh my God. And he had influences that projected him into the movie. He wanted covered in the book. He had specific scenes. It was the greatest gift of all. And so once we still had to shoot photos before the movie started, even though it was a period movie, we still had to acquire period photographs before. Once the movie started, there were days that we were filming specific scenes, and it was on the call sheet, and I had a copy of it, and it says, Phil, the still photographer Phil will shoot such and such a scene. This is for the book. It would have it on a call sheet. And so the whole crew got dialed into it that, oh, we got to do this again, or we got to set up this prop picture just for the book. And so everyone had that in their mind. And it was fabulous. And you know what? That was the shortest movie schedule I'd ever worked. Some of these other movies were like 100 shooting days plus 105, 120. Age of Innocence was maybe 50 days. Unbelievable. In a period movie, we had people wearing costumes and hair and all, and everybody was like, "Oh, this movie's going to be 100 days," and it was very short. And I was,
It's a nice surprise.
well, it is, and it crushed me because I wanted it to go on and on. It's not my money.
Right, right. So let me ask you, you raise a question that I had wanted to ask, and that is, you're compensated obviously to do the work that you do, and you create the images you do, and then whether it's for a book or it's something years, if not decades down the road, who owns the rights to these images, and how do you navigate licensing? How do you navigate, potentially print sales, posters? How does that work within the world of stills?
Oh, generally it's going to be relinquished to work for hires. We're all under union contracts of employment, but there can be addendums and changes. Those early contracts were very, they were like one page,
Okay.
and I would defeat a lot of the wording to it and so forth. But then wasn't until that moment I was kind of like explaining about Marty from Cape Fear that he controlled the imagery. And so he would say, these photos will go to the studio, and then these we will hold back. And that's when I started understanding that process. So when he had the picture with Bob like that, he was so frustrated that it was rejected in terms of their marketing scheme. He just said, here, this is yours. And that's when I went, okay, how does that work? And then I talked to his publicist and this and that. And it was like that was the agreement. So basically, work that I have obtained on his movies and so forth, he has relinquished the licensing, on an as-call basis. So if I go
Okay.
back and say this, and this, as well as it's a reciprocal, so that when people are doing books or any other requests from him, he refers them to me. And the same was with Bob De Niro. There was the reason for the move, if I can extend this,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
was that Bob De Niro was going to and did direct A Bronx Tale, if you remember that movie.
With Chaz Palminteri. Yeah.
Right. So when he was asking me to move to New York, I was still working for Ron, and he goes, and Bob just went, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, Ron's got another movie in Ireland and all of this," and he said, "No, no, no." He goes, "I want you to work for me," and I said, "Yeah, well, when it finishes." And so he calls and says, "Look, I'm going to be directing my first movie, and you have to be in New York." So that's when I, moved from LA and moved to New York to begin that process. But in that, to your answer, was that movie, Bronx Tale, was supposed to be a Universal Studios movie. And so the guys at Universal, the marketing people that by this point, there's a relationship there. So they call me and they're all excited. Oh, you're going to do this and we're going to do this and da, 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 da. So in the process, I have to come to New York, but I'm doing, I think it was maybe Age of Innocence. And that was like the first part when I met the wife and thing. So then they're lining up Bronx Tale to get to it. And then all of a sudden, Universal calls me and says, we're pulling out of financing the movie. And I go, what? And they said, the budget is growing and we don't want to, respectfully, we don't want to support the movie. And I was like, oh my God. And it wasn't. And I said, why are you calling me? And they said, well, maybe you want to go take another job. And I went, no, I don't have a choice. I moved here. I got to do this.
I'm
And
in
I
it.
yeah, I'm stuck. So I was like, holy cow. I said, that's big. And I said, did you tell Bob yet? And they go, no, we're going to tell him. And I go, oh my God, he's going to blow up,
They were trying it. They were trying it out on you. The news.
That's a good way. I'll have to tell. So then, they pull out, and Bob was under the gun himself because he had already started the process. Some people were on payroll and this and that. And when he came to me, he goes, well, what do you want to do? And because they took up the contract, they tore up everything and you got to start all over again. There was no, and Bob was using his own money to like keep it going. And when you say that, you still kind of work and do other things, leading up when they always say, oh, we're going to do the movie. That's an open book. It could be next week. It could be next year. So they go, oh, we're going to get it going. So you go do other things. But he goes, what do you want to do? And I said, well, first of all, I believe in it. And no studio in there, and the words I said was no studio in their right mind would turn this project down. It's your directorial debut. I was trying to get a book out of it as well, and thinking about the future publicity of it. And so I said, listen, don't worry about paying me when you get started. I didn't need the money. And I said, hey, take your money, go contract the vendors, go hire what you need to do. You got to lock up everything to get the ball rolling. I said, I have faith in this project that someone's going to come along and pick up what they call a negative cost to buy the movie. And I said, at that point, I'll make a deal with the studio, whomever it is. And I said, but I want to own everything. And Bob goes, write it up, and I'll sign it. So that's where it started. That relationship with him to have and I said, I want book rights, or what I want to be able to say that I want to have a license to do this with. And he goes, write it up. And his publicist did that. It was all executed. So then we're filming. So then 6 weeks into the project, and I haven't received a check. I don't care. I know it's going to come out at the end. I'm going to get a big bonus out of this.
Sure.
And some guy, so they made a deal with some studio. I'll never forget. Some guy was on the set, and Bob introduced me. He goes, "This is the people that's going to pick up the movie." And the guy goes to me, he goes, "Yeah, and I hear I have to have a conversation with you." And I said, "I bet you do." And so that's when I made the deal, And I said, you got to, first of all, the back pay, that's got to happen. So, then this is the new deal. I own this and that. So that was
Well,
the name of it.
What's interesting to me is that there is a commonly held belief, and I don't necessarily disagree with this belief, that people who are very artistically talented are not always ones who have the sort of business savvy for the dollars and cents of it, and vice versa. And I think that that's often true. But as you've explained what you've done, it really shows me a few things. Not only do you have both sides of that equation, but probably because you do, you were able to sit down with a movie star, Bob De Niro, and have a conversation, have a real personal conversation where you kind of took a little bit of pressure off him. You were not going to be another thing he had to deal with while he was trying to figure out who's going to finance this bigger thing. And even though what you were going to be paid, I mean, it wasn't going to make or break the deal, you were just saying, I don't even want you to worry about that right now, which was probably great from a relationship standpoint. And not only that, but also down the road, it did have a business benefit. But, you were looking to continue the relationship you had with him and kind of be almost partners in it. It's like, we're going to make this work. And I think that a person who is thinking just, very in the moment, and it's a financial consideration too, but they're not thinking that way. And so by you having both sides of the brain, so to speak, I think that's one of the many reasons why you've had the career you've had.
Thank you. Thank you very much. These are great observations that no matter how many times I've recounted some of these stories, that no one has perceived or picked up on those connections. You singly, Mitch, have. So I appreciate you acknowledging that. And as such, it developed into the relationship, as I said, actors that have the kill rights and so forth. So Bob would just, I would collect material and say, look, we want to look at these things. And then when it got to the advertising shoot, which is a separate contract from me doing the publicity side of it, and the studio art department, the creative advertising department would send me the comps and everything that they were thinking. These were like treatment ideas for the post. And I remember some movie, and I don't want to say the name or the studio, but they sent me like 24 things. And I remember sitting with him, and you'd look at these things, and it's from some, vendor or graphic person that says, "Oh, this is what I think the idea of the script is," and it starts looking like, Police Academy or something. It's like a comedy, and it's like, that's not it. This is not a comedy. And so you take those things, and we would edit and go, no, this is not going to happen. Well, maybe, And then he was the kind of person that when we shot these posters, he was, because I knew how to treat it and I knew how to handle it. There was one movie he was in that I was already committed to doing another movie. During that time, I was in Los Angeles. I was doing actually the first movie that Tom Hanks directed, called That Thing You Do.
Mm-hmm,
So
sure.
Tom had asked me to do it right after we did Forrest Gump. So I had committed to that like a year, it was like 6 months or so before, but it was a commitment. In the meantime, Bob was going to do a movie in LA, and the studio, his movie, contacted me and said, "Can you do the poster with Bob? And I said, yeah. And it was maybe the first actual, maybe the second actual full digital capture that I did for a poster. And I showed up, and they were on night shoots, meaning you go to work at 6 at night and they finish at 6 in the morning. And so I did it on a day off from working on Tom Hanks's movie. It was on a weekend. Came in, set up the whole digital shoot, and I'll never forget the art director was there from the studio, and he was a nervous wreck. And I set it up. I had a stand in. I shot the test. I laid it all out. Bob wasn't even, he hadn't even arrived to the set yet. I had everything done. And I said, okay. And it was about 9 o'clock at night. I said, okay, I'm going to go out to my car and I'm going to go to sleep. And I had a phone and a walkie talkie. And I said, I'm going to go take a nap. And they'll come and get me when Bob arrives, and we'll go through. And the art director was like, "What are you talking about? What are you doing?" I said, "Just relax. I got this." And I said, first of all, Bob's going to go to the set. He's going to work. So we may not get this until the sun comes up. When he's finished for the day, then he's going to do this. But I'm set. So at a moment's notice, if he says, "Oh, I got 30 or 40 minutes, let's go try and do it now," I'm ready. I'm never going to be, and that was from day one that I had to shoot Bob. I went and set up in another room and had everything completely ready on Backdraft to shoot some pictures of him. And he walked in, he goes, "Oh, do you have to set up?" I said, "No, I'm ready." I walked over and I flipped the switch on the pack for the strobes to light up. I said, "Here, I'm ready. I've already tested and I'm ready." And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry." I'll never forget. He goes, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'll try and be quick with this makeup." And I said, "Take your time. I'm ready. I got the time." So anyway, we shot the thing like right as the sun was coming up, and this guy had bitten through his nails and
Oh
everything.
gosh.
And I put the whole thing, and in those days, if you remember, there used to be disc packs, these huge, and you had 56 megabytes on this big pack. And I put the whole thing on packs and all of this, and I said, "Here." And I said, "I'm done. Here's my invoice." And he goes, what's this? I said, "Go give it to your graphics people. They'll hug you for this because you won't have to do anything." And, they still printed out contact sheets for people to look at, but they had never, never worked digitally. And I had a monitor that Bob could see as we were shooting, he could review it right there. And I had a Polaroid printer to spit out like even our dye sublimation printer. I said, "Here's the test. Everything's done." And they had never been through that process. And I said, "That's the cleanest, and then I go back and work on another movie the next day." So that's the nature of it. And, that's the relationship, as you mentioned. And Bob was on another movie that, and he's respectful of the directors. That's the key. Bob used to say, "Well, look, you would know 2 or 3 movies down the line." He goes, "Oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this." And then he'd say, well, he would always have to come in because he would never wanted to be disrespectful. He would tell the director, "This is my guy that I want to use." And unless the director had a choice that he wanted to use a still guy or something. And, Bob would ask me. And then the thing is going to obviously happen if you're living in New York and you got Bob and Marty, and they're both doing movies like, Machine Guns at that time. And I remember Bob was saying, "Well, look, after we finished whatever movie we were on," he says, "What are you going to do? Because it may be 2 months before his next job." And I said, "Well, Marty wants to do a movie." And Bob went, "Oh, no, 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 no. You go do Marty's movie. You go do it, right away." He just deferred to Marty. He goes, "If Marty calls you, you go, don't worry about me."
Martin Scorsese definitely treated, rightfully so, with a great deal of reverence and respect. When photography overall sort of transition from film to digital, what sort of advantages and were there disadvantages for you, workflow wise or otherwise, with that evolution?
The very first inkling of digital coming through was actually going back to Parenthood with Ron Howard. And I had read about a system. It was a Sony called Mavica, which was hilarious. And in thinking about relevance of digital technology now, it's like your phone is beyond what
Oh
was
yeah.
there. But I went to Universal on Parenthood and I said, look, there's this system I can shoot digital imagery on the set. And I found, and it had to be, thinking about the technology, it had to be from a transmitter to a receiver. And I found out the New York Times was the only people that had a receiver. And I said, I can shoot imagery on the set and send it through and a bing and a bing. And they said, well, how much is all of it? And I said, in those days, it was like 50 grand. And they said, oh, no, 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 no. Well, you keep shooting film, you know.
Right.
That was the end of that discussion. And then now you cut to about 4 years later, was I found out Nikon had a digital system that they were the first ones coming up with a single lens reflex system. And I get like the very, very pro. I had Nikon come to the set and show me the system. They set it up and everything. And I said, I want it all. And the camera was about 15 grand just for the body. But you could put all the Nikon lenses on it. And you had a video tap, and it was just 1.6 megapixel. That's how low res it was. But
Mm-hmm.
no one was doing it, and I was shooting it. And the point, when you're asking what was the difference, once the producers, pardon me, you could walk on a set and shoot something and go, look, that's the way they wanted it from that point on. They
Mm-hmm.
never wanted to wait. If anything was relative to immediacy, it's the film business. How much does it cost me? Well, they're in their mind, they look at, well, this didn't cost me anything because you had a digital camera and you just put it on a computer, so there's no film cost. They never saw it completely through. So the studios were not behind it, as was that first discussion about that Sony camera, because the studio wanted to maintain control for privacy and for copyright purposes. So in the beginning, when I was introduced to being a still photographer specifically, you only shot two stocks. You shot a black and white, and you shot a color positive, which was slide film. Why, class? Because the positive film is the actual film that goes through the camera. There's no negative, unlike black and white, but there's no color negative. So that's the image. And that, in the studio's mind, that was it. So if somebody said this and this, it's not going to be duplicated. They didn't think it through completely. And so that was the point, that you weren't going to be paying for all of this. Digital was going to pick up that difference, but they put it all on the photographers to buy the hardware and the thing and the thing. And so, I mean, the thousands and thousands of dollars of hardware and everything that's gone through that evolution. And then it's gone circle now in the last few years. So I said always, don't sell the film cameras. When all the photographers, say 25, 30 years ago, were like, oh, this is going to take over the world and blah, blah, blah. I said, don't sell your film cameras. Save the good ones. But, I sold all the digital platforms because I knew that was, it went from initially, like 2.5, 3 megapixels. And then
Right.
when it hit 6 megapixel, there was like a plateau. It got 6.2. I remember there was a Kodak Nikon, elidation of a camera that was 6.2 megapixel. And that hit a point. And then it went up to 10 megapixel. And then you started doing photography that, it was good. That was fine. That was it. You didn't need all of this 40, 50 megapixel. So now it's back to film. And there was a project I did 3 years ago. It was called White House Plumbers for HBO.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about the Watergate break-in, Nixon era, 70s, that kind of stuff. So the initial phone call comes in, and you're on like a conference call, not a Zoom, but I had like 4 or 5 people on the call. It was advertising and publicity people, et cetera. And I said, I want to shoot film on this for specific scenes. And these people were screaming in ecstasy on the phone. I said, what's wrong? And they said, no, which is great. We finally have a photographer who knows how to shoot film. And he says, we have photographers who don't even know how to load the camera. And I thought, well, that's embarrassing,
Yeah.
But I shot 150 rolls of film on a 5-part 1 hour series called White House Plumbers. But I didn't shoot everything on film. If there was dialogue scene or this or that, you still, I would use the film cameras to duplicate historical photos or scenes that were specific to the story, like the Senate hearing with John Dean, former Attorney General, and John Mitchell. And so, things that were already part of history, things that I knew this covered in film is going to look historical and carry
Sure.
the project. So I shot multi formats. I shot Hasselblad for 2.25, shot Leica, and shot Nikon silver lenses, which, if you understand what that meant, was from the 70s. So I used period lenses on F2s and Fs,
Oh,
old
wow.
Nikon. So I had the whole rig set up. And, it was like a flea market on the set that I came rolling in the cart with everything. And people would come and snoop around. I said, these are not prop cameras. These are my cameras.
So, with that evolution from film to digital, and then we go to mirrorless. And the reason I'm bringing up mirrorless for those people who love going to movies and they're trying to understand, they go to a movie, they hear the dialogue. What they don't hear is fill in the corner and your shutter going off. There was something that does not float above sporting events, but yet is a blimp. And this was a device used to deaden the sound of you making pictures. So maybe you can kind of explain for the uninitiated the role that a blimp played, how it worked, and how mirrorless has really kind of made the blimp unnecessary.
Thank you. Boy, these are great. This is all a great flow. And I'm sorry if I'm like pontificating here, but
No, it's great. I love it.
so in the introduction to, okay, I thought it was going to be a camera assistant and work in film. And I said, no, you got to shoot stills and you got to get a blimp. I said, okay. So this was in the early 80s. And there was one guy in the whole world. He and this guy's father, and subsequently his son, took it over. It's 1/4 inch steel. It's like a lunchbox that has padding, soundproof padding inside. And they are the most unergonomically designed device. Now, if you picture a box, and I'm going to try and visual, I should have had one here, and it's like that big. It covers your face and everything, and you have about a 3/4 of an inch hole in the back that mates up to the viewfinder, and it's wired to the motor drive inside. So when you depress a button on the front, the camera will click, the motor drive will spin. I'll hear it because the thing is against my face. Someone within some proximity to me may or may not, depending on the padding and what lens you're using. But it's supposed to be a device that dampens the sound so that it doesn't interrupt the recorded sound of dialogue and so forth. That being said, it used to walk such a thin, thin line because actors of recent, not so much the real older ones, but because they looked at it as we're theatrical actors. We're not distracted by things. We're here to perform, and then you get the young actors that that there's a siren I can hear, like in the next street over. Oh, that's going to be a big distraction. So, but they can hear this blimp.
Right, right.
So that being said, so then I had multiple blimps because you had to have a different blimp for each model. So if you had
Oh
a
my God.
Nikon F3, you had a blimp. If you had an F2 with a motor drive, you had a blimp. If you had an F4, you had a blimp. So these things were not cheap. And then whatever lens you put on, they had a collar on the front, and you could spin the lens. The most control you had was to focus it. And then when it came out with autofocus, oh my God, that saved the day. Then some guy had to put a button so you could focus lock. To me, I thought that was like sliced bread. I'm like, oh, so you're not rotating this thing, and sometimes that would go eat, eat, and you go, oh, great. This is, there's all of these things to defeat it. So after all of this blimp experience, and plus there were just the weight, was just too much, and you'd have two or on your shoulders and doing all this. So then they come up with mirrorless, and the first experience in using it was actually a Nikon V1 for a technical side of it. It's a 2/3 chip camera, and I'm doing this because it was no bigger than a phone. It was very thin, and the first thing I did was find out who made different lens mounts. So it was already designed that you put obviously through their corresponding mount, you could use uh, Nikon digital autofocus lenses on that camera, but it was like a big lens with this little camera on the back, or you'd use the V series lenses, which were not fast, but I said, I'm diving into it because it's mirrorless. And you had the ability to take the screen in the back and flip it up so you could actually go right on the deck, on the floor, and shoot right from the floor. So I find the mounts, big thing was to find someone that made Leica mounts, Leica M mounts and R mounts, which is the rangefinder mounts and the reflex Leica lenses. So I'm on the set using this little camera. It's about this big, 2/3 of a chip, 10 or 12 megapixel with a couple of $1,000 Leica lens on the front of it. But gorgeous, gorgeous. And I've told people, I said, that was the first, introduction to mirrorless for me. And I shot 5 movies with it, like bing, bing, bing. They were all in a row. And people were just stunned. And the work and this, or you get a second body, and then I'm still having to use a conventional Nikon with 200 millimeter or something else. You still have a whole array of equipment. And then by that time, Nikon started coming out with mirrorless digital bodies. So then you go through that D this and D that, and then you start getting into the mirrorless and a thing and a thing. It's just like money, the money
Oh yeah.
train is shooting them like this. But one of the statements that I'd always said, and my son he remembers everything, but I said, you always want to keep your lenses. And I was taught that by mentors along the way. The glass is what makes the picture. The camera itself is just a vehicle. It's a click, it's a chip, it's a piece of film, whatever it is. It's only as good as what's in front of the focal plane. So if it's like a glass, you want to put that on an inferior or a lesser body, you're going to get a good picture.
Yeah, yeah. So, and that actually raises a question. I use the expression, go out the door to shoot, and you can tell me if this varies, whether it's television or motion picture. But what is the complement of lenses, or your most often used lenses? Because I'm thinking that sometimes you're shooting in relatively close quarters, and then sometimes it's a much bigger scene, and the amount of distance can be fairly considerable. But sort of day in, day out, are these 24s, 50s, 85s, 135s? I'm just trying to get my mind around that.
Good question. And again, it's what is a kit? The kit. So in the beginning, when you're shooting film on a set, it was prime lenses. No one shot zooms because zooms were designed that they were slow, it was inferior, blah blah, for whatever reason. And in early high school career, high school time working at a camera store, it was the best way to learn. Everyone should do an internship at a camera store because then you've got a complete array. And we sold Nikon, Canon, Minoltas, this, and you learn lenses and you learn selections and you learn angles. So I always knew from also what was available. You start with a 50, so you can either go 35, 50, 85, 135. So you had primes. The point of the question is, what is your kit when you walk out the door? I only had primes. So you had, 35, 50, 85, 135. Then if you want to go wider, depending on whose line it was, a 24, a 28, then you could expand from there. And I still have a Leica kit of my lenses, my primes, that way. So no matter. The other good note to bring up is that from my mentors, and again, passing it on to my students, to lecturers, to my son, I always remember when you're asked to shoot something for a job, and the art director, whatever the task is, and this is to answer your question of what to bring, what to pack. When they say, look, we need you to shoot this picture, and you go, blah, 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 and then they spill it out to you that they had in their mind what it is anyway. First question I ask, and I've always had a couple of art directors say, gee, I never get asked that. What is it being used for? How is it being used? And when do you need it? because that will dictate how I'm going to package out to shoot the image. And if they say, we need it like yesterday, okay, so your mind starts thinking, well, okay, it's going to be a digital platform of some sort. And they'll say, all I need is a headshot of Mitch behind the desk and this and this. Okay, it's an 85. How is it going to be used? Well, it's going to be on a Zoom and it's going to be like this big that we're going to see in the movie. Okay, well, I don't get, it could be anything at that point. The platform doesn't dictate how it's going to be. Sometimes you shoot something and I'll say, oh, we're going to blow this up to 2 stories high. And, we want to be able to recognize eyelashes at 2 stories high. And you go, okay, well, now we're talking, medium format with a digital back, a couple of lens selections for that. That it all rotates, it's all dictated. And then what's the bottom line to this class? Budget. Because then they're going to come
Sure.
back and say, well, we don't have any money. And you go, okay, here's my phone. Where is it? Here's my phone. Let me know how it works out for you. No hard
Yeah.
feelings.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And by doing that, not only are you determining the lenses you need and the format of the camera you need, but you're also really nailing down what are the deliverables so that after the fact they don't say that's not what I wanted, or but I also needed, and that gets to the business side where you really want to nail that down. In your experience with your type of work, are most still photographers, it sounds like, working directly with those hiring them, or do many still photographers have agents that are kind of canvassing the production world to see who might want to use their client, the still photographer, for various projects? And I'm thinking about that because an agent will get in the middle to help really break down what does the client want, what are the deliverables, are they sure, make sure the contract language is clear. And whereas another photographer might be very capable, but they're just not, they just don't have the savvy, the experience to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks.
I've come to respect the category of team. And I would always be, because I'm figuring, why go through all these other channels that I was also taught? Just talk to me. Tell me what it's about. Tell me
Mm-hmm.
this and the other. At some point in the career, say 25 or more, or 30 years ago, say, I got talked into having an agent. And I signed with an agency. And within, good Lord, a week, at least, I get a call from a vice president at one of the studios, a guy that I had known and worked for, you know, through him at other studios. And he just goes, Bill, what are you doing? What you know, and I went, what happened? He goes, you don't need an agent. You're throwing money away. We know who you are. We know where to find you. That's what it was amounting to. But I had signed initially for a 6-month contract, blah, blah, blah. The person barely got one job for me. So I said, I did better I always did better on my own anyway. So there was nothing that. With that said, however, it comes to whom you rely on. So luckily, after arriving in New York, after a few years, I became close with another still photographer through a mutual friend. It was a producer. So he then emerged as, it's hard to even say, he's like a partner. He was my associate producer. He's an associate. He was an assistant. And he is a fashion photographer who was at the top level, the top
Mm.
level. And he comes to me one night on a set. And his version is, he always said that I just happened to have like a box of 8x10s in one of those Kodak 500 sheet boxes
Mhm.
that I was roughing through a Scorsese movie. And he comes in and I just went like, whoosh, and opened the box and threw the prints out. And he just went, oh my God. It's like all of this stuff. And he had a formidable portfolio with 1114s, gorgeous, gorgeous photographs, but like runways and fashions. And I said, I don't know fashion, but I'm looking at runway. And when these models are coming down, they are looking right in your lens. The stuff that I've seen has always been from the side angle of a runway shot of like a model
Yeah.
walking down the runway. I said, these people are coming right down and then nailing your lens. And he says, that's because he shoots for the designer and they know that. And I went, oh, I didn't know this. So he was a top man, but he worked with me. There was never a for me. He worked with me. And so it took him to Greece, took him to LA, wherever it was, wherever I had like a commercial job or something I needed help. I got him in the union. He became a second shooter for me on sets. I gave him jobs that he would do TV jobs or film jobs. So I mean that's the part of saying I didn't need an agent. I just needed a good co-pilot to go along.
Mm-hmm.
And Tom Concordia is his name, and just a wonderful guy. And when Vincent, whom you know as merged as a photographer, when my son decided he wanted to be a photographer, first thing I told him was, go work for Tom. Don't come. He's been around me. I said, go work for Tom because and I'm thinking. I told my wife because Tom can yell at you and not be, I don't have to have the guilt of it, so learn from
Yeah.
someone else. And he did. He shot for him and he assisted Tom and everything. And Tom would call him the way I would. But I would get jobs and first phone call would be to Tom. And I go, now we start building the camera, the equipment package. We start designing the shots and everything. And I relied on him heavily. I was on a movie in LA and I had to come back to New York immediately and start another project. But the first prep of it was to shoot a complete photo gallery with Al Pacino. And I'd already photographed Al, so he knew me. But then it was a huge build out. And I got to Tom and we laid out the equipment. So as first assistant, he hired another guy and he set it up. And it was all in the studio. I'll never forget. I had to take a red eye and I came right from the airport right to the stage. And I walked in and he had everything set up. And as I walked in, he took the Hasselblad and put it in my hand and said, go. And I went, then he goes, I even set up a little room with a cot for you to take a nap.
Oh, wow.
you know,
That's anticipation right there.
and
That's
he
great.
knew I was coming in, and Al had to go through wardrobe changes and stuff. So I had 45 minutes or so in between. And it was a wonderful shoot. It was fabulous. And when I took him to Greece, it was the same thing that we were a team and we had to do the poster shoot and everything before the movie started. Like we had a week to get it done and we had to scout locations, line it all up and everything. And the shoot day went fabulous. And it was shooting a digital back on a Hasselblad, but we're in Santorini. So everything had to be, it was a private jet there. So we had to carry stuff. And then in the loadout, something hit me like a few days before. I said, something, Tom, we're going to be on an island. And, to get something from Athens was going to be even 2 days. And I said, this is ridiculous. I said, I'm just fearful. We're going to have film as a backup, but we're shooting a phase back on a Hasselblad. I said, I think I want a complete double system. I want two complete Hasselblads with backs. And a rental house had never had, they had just come out or something. And so they made us a deal. So we had two complete cameras. And guess what? We definitely needed it because it was hot as heck. And
Yeah.
while
Yeah.
I'm shooting, as you know, the thing overheats. So all I had to do was pop a lens off and take another body and throw it on and keep shooting. So, it's anticipated, but it's only from having the agent would have done nothing for me for that job.
Right. Right. Yeah. The agent's going to be the business side. They're not going to know that. So I want to ask you a composition question. So, when I travel around and I do, in addition to sports and wildlife, a lot of street photography all over. So whether it's New York City or it's Old Delhi in India or the streets of Hanoi, Vietnam, I walk out there and there's so much going on. And so what we as photographers have to do is identify the subject, what catches our eye. And, it could be we find the light and we wait for something interesting to come into it, or we can see people or situations that are developing into something that in anywhere from 10 seconds to 10 minutes could be something. And then that's how, I work when I'm on the street. My question is, from a composition standpoint, when you're shooting what you're shooting on a set, there are certain deliverables, things that you absolutely know you want to get, some angles that you've already anticipated. But that said, when you're there, you're going to see other things that you hadn't already pre-visualized. So, I know it's not street photography and things are not happening spontaneously, but what is spontaneous is what's going on in your head as you're seeing new compositions you hadn't even thought about before. So, how do you kind of go through that process of, oh, here's that shot, but wait a minute, the angle over there might be better and different. And maybe when that guy comes into the scene, I can get this other shot because of the light coming in. Like that calculus that I think goes on in all of our heads. How do you manage that on set?
Dude, you are brilliant. You are.
I got to send you a check after this
No,
podcast.
I'm serious. I'm not trying to blow it here, but just, really to have the appreciation and understanding and the articulation of these questions. Vincent didn't sell you short by saying, we had to get together. It's truly the single word out of that answer. The answer to this question is patience, is anticipation, is patience, is watch on a set. uh, I would also even defer to the type of photography Vincent does, my son does, because he's on the street. He's similar in those things, but he's learned vis-a-vis either through osmosis, through me, or observing other artwork in his life and what's going on, is that he will defend a photograph is what I go, like I don't challenge it, but he will defend it and says, look how I got this shadow that's going this way. And this is the reason I composed it like this. And he will explain it to me. So that's going on in his head. For me, it's always, I've been mentored by who, what, when, where, and where's the check, so I'm on a timeline. That's the film that I can create art in seconds. And that was one of the things. So when you say, how do I know? I just sit on a set and I'm constantly looking, I'm constantly shooting and seeing what's going on and anticipating that I know I can. The thing was, from the many, many movies over the years with De Niro, I could tell when he was going to turn his head, that how many times he was going to blink his eye and what was going to happen. So that there was going to be an anticipation of something, or if the director is going to go into a room or an actor is going to do this. And it's just looking and anticipation and patience of waiting. Because sometimes a crew member would go, why are you just standing there? I said, I'm waiting. I said, I just know body and I know people and I know what's going to happen, or feel a reaction to something. I said, just give me a minute. And then I'll wait, and then it'll happen. And then I feel satisfied and redeemed that this is what it is, if that's what you're getting at. But as far as to try it photojournalistically, you can stay there on a set and it's like the bombs are going off, but things are happening and this and that. Mm-hmm. You're shooting arbitrarily, but it's just, you have to sit there and judge the moment. And while in review, it was like, there's many photographs that I've acquired on set have been one frame. It's not a motor drive just blasting through stuff. Sure. So it is those anticipations. The one I was previously describing is from Casino, and Sharon Stone in her death scene. She falls on the ground. She stayed down there, but Marty was back at the other end of the room, 30 feet away with the camera, with the movie camera. And then he gets up to go talk to her. And I'm walking behind Marty. And I know he's going to go bend down to get to her level. And it was very slow and meticulous. And I had the camera, and he just knelt down, and I went click, and I did one frame, and I got up and I said, that's it. And when the film went through the lab and it goes to the studio and the photo editor, like a week later, she calls me up, the photo editor, and screaming on the phone, you got it. She goes, this is the most amazing. The picture will never see the light of day for advertising or this. Mm-hmm. But as a creative photograph, at least there's somebody like you, Mitch, that's got an eye and is going, appreciatively, that's a beautiful moment, you know, because it's a silhouette of Scorsese and you can see his eyebrows. And that's the picture behind. You can see his eyebrows, you know, and someone pointed out there's only one little, you know, sprinkling of light on his hand. The rest of it, he's in black. You know, he's just silhouetted. It's his hand, his eyebrow, and Sharon Stone on the floor. And they go, that's great. I said, I saw it. I knew that he was going to fall into the moment. And that was it.
It's a storytelling image, as the term goes. You know, and one of the things that I have realized about myself is that whether it is shooting an event or on the street or whatever it is that I'm doing, you know, I could be going to the dentist office, that my eye is always seeing compositions. I'm always seeing light. And, you know, I was watching a documentary this morning, oddly enough, about David Bailey, the great British fashion photographer. And Bailey, as he was known, he was talking to someone and he said, I began photographing you in my mind the moment you walked in the door. And I just, you know, when I'm living life and walking around, I cannot help but see compositions if I had an actual camera in my hand, but I'm seeing them in my head. And I feel like, I don't know whether that's an occupational hazard, if it's a blessing, if it's just the way it is. But do you find that when you're living just life, you can see things while you're driving, whatever, and you think, there's a picture. There's a picture. Oh yeah, that my dog, my cat. Yeah, oh my God, if my cat could only turn half a turn to the left, my cat would look amazing. Like, and because I feel like what you just talked about with the Sharon Stone, Martin Scorsese picture, you anticipated that moment was going to happen and you were not going to miss that. And I don't think that happens if you're thinking about getting a Diet Coke after somebody says cut.
You bring me to tears. But it's one of the things I used to say was I consistently kept shooting, even though the director goes cut, and I learned that
Mm-hmm.
from Ron Howard was that he would call from the very first movie from Parenthood. We had a bunch of little kids. He wouldn't even say cut, and he would just look at the operator and do this or something. They'd turn the camera off, but all these other electric moments were still happening, and I just kept shooting. So that's where I felt that was along those lines of just seeing things and anticipate. There was something. Oh, and what I do is walk around. I love what you said. You can send ESP to your cat. You just have to go turn your head, turn your head, turn. Send it. And no, if you will it, it will happen. And then the other thing is, instead of compositionally, I respect that, but I think it's from me also feeling I wanted to shoot film initially. I wanted to be a director of photography. I'm more conscious, to be all honest, more conscious and respectful of light. Because from a movie standpoint, whenever they say, "Oh, we have to hold filming because there's a plane going over here," something, and then you have these old cameramen that would go, well, "This movie's not about sound; it's about how it looks," you know. And that was the community that I was in. So, and Vincent's heard it, and I've said it before, even to a group at the Leica International Conference. I said I walk around my house and just look at light. I look at the way light falls around the house at different times of the day, at different seasons, and it's just like I'm constantly, seeing light coming through on the windows or anything. So to to your end of it, it's just you look at composition. I feel composition is in there, but if you don't have something to establish a base, a gamma of light, then you know, then it's going to be, a fight, one or the other. I'm either going to
Mm-hmm.
have it posed the way I want, but then you're not going to see it. So I defer to light, and it's always one of the first or third people I meet. Always on a set, my best friend's the gaffer, who's the chief electrician. No, seriously, he may be the cameraman, and I've worked with some, and I was acquiring that list only through some of the early work of working on Dino De Laurentiis's movies. Before meeting Ron Howard, I did a half of 5 movies with his company. That he was the first guy in set up in North Carolina. He was bringing Italian DPs and production designers and English old guys that worked on the James Bond movies. I worked with the cameraman, Jack Cardiff, who shot The African Queen. I mean, give me a break. I worked,
Wow.
I worked with a director who did Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, but he also did 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He did Tour. These guys were in their 70s and 80s, but De Laurentiis brought them over. You know, who shot the Schwarzenegger thing, Conan? It was Jack Cardiff, like historical people. And you learn, one of my mentors said, no matter what you do, what time you spend around somebody, you learn one thing. You want to walk away with one thing. And it's the truth. Every mentor, I've had three mentors, and I've worked with these guys, and you'll pick it up. And they always, respect light. So that's what I said. I walk in and meet the gaffer, because a lot of times in the television end of things, they're moving like this, and this. And I would want to get that shot of Mitch at the table. One last, we shot the scene of this for an hour. And then they go, okay, now we're going to break it up and let's go over there. And I'd already talked to the gaffer. I said, look, when we finish this setup before we blow out of here, leave the lights, please. Just give me 30 seconds or something. And he'd get on the radio and go, guys, don't pull anything yet. Phil's shooting. And I go, bing, 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 bing. And the rest of the people are moving and they're doing other things. And I'm doing this. And when it's over, you go right on. And he's, the gaffer is your buddy. And that's the way it is. If you don't have the team mentality that we're all here, but also the fact is very early, all of these people are not there for my benefit. They're making a movie. And I'm just there as like as icing to this for the marketing department. Sometimes you're rejected, that they say, no, we don't want to have anything to do with you. But you have to be able to come in and befriend everyone. And luckily, I was in companies of just wonderful people, and you're not there to alienate yourself or try and alienate the product. They know why you're there. The old people within film world, they can do everybody's job, and they can smell when a person doesn't know their job. That's the key. The third prop guy can come in and fumble something. It's like a team play, and the guy messes up, and everybody starts, the eyeballs start looking around, go, oh, this guy's a rookie. You got to keep an eye out. He might drop the ball, and then somebody gets hurt, and all of this kind of stuff. So it's a cruel world, but it's also a very family oriented, because the reality is I spent more time the first 30, 40 years of this with these people, with the crews, than I did with my own family. I've been here now 1 year this week that I filed retirement papers, but I'm still working. That you can still go do stuff. I did some television work down in the city, but you go down, you do that, and you come home. But it's all this past year. I told my wife, I said, I'm walking around. I said, God, I never knew what this house was like during the week. I said, I'm sitting here on a Wednesday, in the middle of the day, and I'm looking at the light. I said, wow, this is amazing. So that's it.
Well, you got
It's
a
not,
lot to
but
enjoy the next 40 years doing that. Well, listen, Phil, I want to thank you very sincerely for your generosity of time and sharing stories and just everything that you've done. I know that listeners are going to want to find out where they can see more of your work and kind of go down the rabbit hole of all the things that you've done. Where are the best resources for people to be able to do that?
if it's a cinematic cinephile group of people, and it's amazing that the general public knows of the site IMDb, which is
Mm-hmm.
a movie database. Even everyone acknowledges it. You type my name, and that'll do the rollout of all of the 100 and so movies that I've worked on. So that can be one source. And through that, there's a link to my website, which is philipcaruso.net. And it'll go through, and there's buttons of images, as well as when this is released, and with your blessing, I will tag it and put it on the link to my site, as these other ones are also, these interviews and so forth are there. So that's one way to just go through it and see it. But the funny thing is, I used to check Google, and I'd type my name every now and then and see it, and I'd see it go up like 1.5 million, 2 million. I'd see where things are going. And sometimes if you click images and it just does a spew, like a contact sheet of images, it's pretty funny sometimes. because
Yeah,
then, oh God, that was something I did like 20 years ago or something. And they chose that one that, spotted my name to it.
that's
There's
great.
a source. They can always find it.
Well, I really appreciate that. And for those who want to check out what I have going on, probably the most up to date is Instagram at Mitch Stringer Images. You can feel free to shoot me a DM if you have any questions about photography, travel photography, whatever it is. Feel free to do that. I'm happy to respond. I get a number of those each week and get back to everybody pretty timely. You can also take a look at the website if you like. That's Mitch Stringer Images as well. And so until next time, I wish everybody great light. I wish you great shooting, and we'll talk again soon.